All right, so just by way of introduction, my name is Greg Wardis. I'm a digital security and compliance specialist here at Microsoft. And as we kind of look through the agenda for today, we wanted to simply start by just saying thank you. We know that all of you have busy schedules, and the fact that we're on your calendar for about an hour today, we don't take it lightly. So thank you for being here. So in an attempt to make today a little bit more interactive, a little bit more engaging, we've set aside a number of $25 gift cards, and we're going to be handing those out over the course of the presentation for those of you that are active in the chat. So please ask questions in the chat and grab lunch on us. This is your time, so propose your questions so we can make this as valuable for you as possible. All right, so obviously we're here to talk about data lifecycle management. And I think the best place to start is to maybe identify what the challenges are. You've probably heard the term or the idea of data explosion, which is that records are everywhere. The volume of information that's being created and the choices that we have for collaboration tools, it's making the task of managing records and managing data much more difficult. But if we think about records management, what we're really discussing is how is business critical content and how does it need to be stored? How is that met with the constantly changing regulations? Even the shape and the path of a record has evolved from what used to be kind of a formal documentation from the CEO or maybe the CFO by approving a purchase or approving a project with some sort of tangible document. That's now being done via Teams messaging, saying something as simple as go ahead and proceed. So the scope of what needs to be considered, that too has expanded into new avenues, utilizing new tools. Another challenge is around the inconsistency and the sensitive topic of user error. For years, we've been relying on end users to be able to correctly categorize records and then store them in the right location, but also at the same time, asking them to focus on the duties of the various roles they've been hired to do. So if you've been in IT for a minute, everybody wears multiple hats, and there's certainly no difference here with somebody that's managing data. Sadly, that scenario has made it easier for records to get lost. We're asking users to not only move records to a different location, but they also need to do a categorization of that data in some sort of system of record. If you've ever been in the sales role, or if you've ever been around a sales organization, you've probably heard the term, if it's not in CRM, it doesn't exist. That's a high level example, but it's a prime example of where data lives and what's getting recorded and what's considered lost. And then finally, the number of updates to regulations is an overwhelming conversation because these records and these regulations are ever changing. Every time the regulations are updated, those that are doing records management need to evaluate the new requirements and then figure out if those updates affect the requirements. Now maybe they need to keep additional information to meet those requirements, and so on and so forth. And that's a convoluted conversation all in itself. So let's take a closer look at what ever-changing actually means. And this is the only build slide I have, I promise. Most organizations struggle to keep up with the amount of data that's being produced, whether that's from end users, line of business applications, IoT devices, or anything in between. It is difficult to keep up with a data set that is growing. The explosion of data isn't really helped by the fact that the world is becoming much more regulated by the minute. Local and national governments are creating new laws. We've got industry-specific agencies that are adding or updating their directives. And then even internally, our organizations are creating policies to regulate how we store and share data. And then not to be overlooked, but also how and when we dispose of information. And I'm going to come back to that here in just a second. But to stay on the regulatory body, there's more than 200 updates per day from over 1,000 regulatory bodies. This can be extremely overwhelming to keep up with. And it probably seems a little bit daunting, and in many cases, it probably is. But there is a little bit of hope there. Almost 70% of organizations are now using AI to automate their IG. We're now finding ourselves in a position to truly make zero trust more than just a buzzword and truly implement a zero trust as a strategy. We should plan that we're going to be breached. We should have a plan in place to minimize our potential impact. But we also need to find that balance of keeping data that we need for either regulations and for day-to-day business. But also on the flip side of that coin, we need to find a way and a process to get rid of the data that we don't need, all in an effort to minimize our attack surface. And that's really the end goal of what we're talking about here today. And as it relates to the attacks, I would even venture to say that it's not really a matter of if, but a matter of when. And if that is the case, and we can agree on that, and all of our heads are shaking in the same direction, we have to be prepared so we're not labeled as an organization that reacts to threats, but truly an organization that is proactive and has security and compliance as part of our company culture. So let's circle back to the idea of reducing your attack surface. This isn't really one of those suggestions that's debated or even a hard sell internally to our upper management. What is a hard sell and is a challenge is changing our company culture. Not only is it a hard sell, but it's a challenging task for any organization. As long as our data has value, the more we need to adopt security into our company culture. It's more like our IT security departments cannot be solely responsible for data security. Embedding data security into our company culture is now one of those marks for future-proofing your organization. I think it's safe to assume that everybody on this call probably knows what Moore's Law is, but in short, it's smaller, cheaper, faster, right? So Moore's Law and new technology has made it easy for everybody to create new content, store it in a fashion that's simple and is easy, and then it's also easy to repeat that process. So the data explosion is real, and the aftermath is something that we're all now dealing with today, both at work and in a lot of circumstances at home. And the reason I bring that up is I just got an email the other day that stated my picture storage for my cell phone was above the 70% mark. And my choices were I could either purchase some additional storage, which I think is probably their end goal, or I could go through that daunting process of making the decision of how to clean up my pictures. I'm sure you've all seen that email before, right? So this picture is my attempt at humor. This is a pretty solid representation of my cell phone picture storage. It's got things like woodworking projects, kids, dogs, nieces and nephews, accidental screenshots, pictures of my pockets. But sadly, our organizations in many ways are very similar. We're now in kind of a pack rat culture where we can easily keep everything. We have choices upon choices. What tools, how many tools, what locations, and in a lot of cases, how many locations, how many copies, how many versions. In fact, this deck alone, I think, is either on the third or fourth version. Yeah. But am I going to remember to come back and delete the ones prior to this when today concludes? I've been in IT now for almost 20 years, and I honestly cannot remember any organization that I've either worked with or worked for that had a clearly defined process and an easy guide to follow around data disposal. And then my second attempt at humor here, in case you missed it, this is what I would consider the physical equivalent to taking a picture of your pocket, right? I have no idea what that thing is, but somebody deemed it important enough to go up on the top shelf. There's no clear path to it. It's probably difficult to remove, so it stays there. And for our data, I think that's a good tangible example. And then Lighthouse here in a second is going to highlight how organizations can shrink the attack surface, which it starts with the obvious: know your data. Once that data has been classified, how do we best protect that data? And then once we have the proper controls in place, how do we prevent it from being either mishandled or even lost? And then finally, how do we establish a culture of governing your data and then deleting the data that no longer adds value? And then finally, when we start talking about the size of data, it's more than obvious that a lot of organizations need to and have started to take advantage of tools like machine learning and AI. Now, identifying credit card numbers, social security numbers, addresses, things like that, that have a clear identifiable pattern, that's one thing. But in 2023, we need more than just that. We need trainable classifiers for things like, I don't know, employee exit dates. When do we purge that personal data? Is it weeks, months, or even years down the road? We need the assistance of intelligence that can ensure regulations are met and the organization remains compliant. This is where Microsoft is in a unique position to assist. Purview helps with both audit, compliance, insider risk, and obviously data lifecycle management. Microsoft leverages AI machine learning to ensure that these tasks are not only done on time, but are dealt with in a time frame that actually has your organization's attack surface in mind. That's both now and in the future. So not only is taking advantage of AI and machine learning critical when we're discussing things like data lifecycle management or other complex, technologies, but again, coming back to that culture shift, but also leaning on a trusted partner. This is not a task that you as an organization have to do alone. People like Lighthouse have security and compliance at the heart of their company and at the heart of their culture. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Heather from Lighthouse.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And good afternoon, everyone. To echo what Greg said, thank you for being here. I understand that an hour out of anybody's time is a lot of time. So first off, I saw some familiar names in our attendee list here. So I am thrilled to see not just familiar names, but people that I've worked with. And so it's really great to full circle, see you guys again after an engagement now here. So thank you so much for that. And I hope that you really find some value out of what we're going to talk about next, focusing on some real high critical considerations when you're building out your electronic records management framework. Let me go ahead and start sharing. All right, here we go. As mentioned, our agenda today is really going to be focusing on regulatory compliance as the first piece. I'm going to really focus on the privacy regulations and landscape here. We're going to talk about the records lifecycle management. We'll move into some classification and taxonomy. We're going to talk about change management. That's a really big component in all of this. There is so much else going on behind the scenes of planning for this and getting ready for that. And then you have to stop and think about, what is this overall impact on our users? And how are we going to get them on board with the change management piece? So very, very important, which is why it's listed in here. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices and what you can do. And I'm actually going to end with challenging you guys for a question at the very end. So again, welcome here to key considerations for operationalizing your electronic records management. Again, here we're going to explore some fundamental questions. I might ask some questions. They might be rhetorical, not really meant for an answer right now, but things that you could go away with asking yourself, asking others, bringing those questions to the table later. Organizations should ask these prior to launching and any effort to implement your electronic records management framework in their organization. Maybe you've already implemented something and you're looking to take it to the next level. So this will also cover that. You might be in more of a simplistic mode right now, but you're looking to expand it, adapt it. Same thing goes for that. These are some critical questions and considerations that you're going to want to think about and look to address as you're working on either the next stage, implementation, what have you, throughout your electronic records management. So regulatory compliance being our first piece here, really compliance with relevant laws and regulations is paramount. They're flying in at us at the speed of light, right? Every time we turn around, I feel like there's a new privacy regulation coming out. There's a new regulatory law coming out. As technology is evolving, some of these regulations are coming out and they're realizing that we need to put some things around all the information that's being collected at companies. And to that, it's really important that we as practitioners understand that the specific legal requirements governing electronic records in our jurisdiction, in our industry, some of us are much highly regulated than others, thinking maybe our financial services, you're on one level, maybe retail, not quite as much. I come from an education background and it was extremely highly regulated. When I went to retail, it was very, very different in that it was less regulated. So, you have to weigh that as well. Understand where you're at, what applies to you. Looking at your organization, tailoring those electronic record management frameworks to what's going to meet your standards and what's going to meet your business operations. Everybody does things a little bit different. And so your culture comes into play as well. This could also include data retention, privacy, and even e-discovery requirements. So the first question I want to ask you guys, and I really want this to be the bottom line question as we're talking about this afternoon, is the juice worth the squeeze? And by asking that, what I'm really trying to get at is whether or not the potential benefits or rewards of your action, effort, even investment are going to be worth the time, energy, or resources required to achieve them. In many cases, yes. And in many cases, I've been such an advocate for that I kept bringing bags and bags and bags of oranges and saying, keep squeezing it. It's going to be worth it, I promise. It took a long time, but it does become worth it. So really, it essentially asks whether the outcome justifies the input, the effort, even the sacrifice. Juice here in this context, oops, sorry about that, folks, is referring to the desirable outcome that we want to get to, that reward, that benefit that we all hope to obtain. The squeeze, that represents the actual effort of work, of sacrifice, whatever it is that you need, the organization needs to attain that outcome. So when you're being asked it's really looking at weighing the pros worth the cons, looking at that cost benefit ratio, justifying expenditures for your resources. And I'm referring to all the resources here. It could be tangible, it could be time, capital through money, even effort. So all types of resources here, using that term a little loosely throughout. It really is a way of questioning whether that return on investment is going to be favorable, or if there might be a better use of someone's time somewhere else. So keeping that in the back of your head as we go through some of our slides this afternoon. I want to talk specifically about whether or not the juice is worth your squeeze with data privacy, just because there's so much happening in the data privacy landscape today in compliance with privacy regulations, especially in the context of managing data, is important for several reasons. First off, we've got our legal requirements, right? We know that privacy regulations are established by governments, states, authorities to protect the rights and privacy of individuals. So with non-compliance, it could result in legal consequences, including fines, legal actions, you name it, right? So ensuring compliance is really critical to avoid legal liabilities. The second main piece here is protection of personal identifiable information. So that coveted PII, right? I know even just working in this industry, how important it is. And because of that, I am far more considerate about what type of PII I share. I was at the doctor's a couple weeks ago. They wanted to put my credit card on file, not because I had a copay, not because I had a balance. They just wanted it on file. And I was really conflicted about that. I thought, why would you take this very important piece of information from me if there wasn't an immediate need for it? So it made me really stop and think about that. And I know that this is the way things are going today, but as practitioners, as professionals in this industry, we stop and we actually really think about that. And we know that by giving this, if the right systems aren't in place to secure and protect, we ultimately know what could happen as a result of it. So I definitely had some reservation in it. I'm not going to tell you guys what I ended up doing, but you can guess. And, it just made me pause to think, was this really necessary? And to that, excessive data can contain sensitive personal identifiable information or just sensitive data in general. And so we want to make sure that the spirit behind this mandate is really there. And that is so that it protects an individual's personal data from unauthorized access, breaches, even misuse. And that's what really made me question that. If there wasn't a need for that credit card to be on file to pay a balance, to have a copay on there, it made me question, what if somebody gains unauthorized access to this now? What if there's a breach? It was a liability to me, which made it go into the second piece that I want to talk about here, which is reputation and trust. Violations of privacy regulations can end up damaging an organization's reputation, especially if there's been a long-standing, very valued reputation that's held very high. Something happens, a data breach. We know it's happened with Target. We know it's happened, I remember early on with banks and even Michael's craft store very early on. And so I lost trust then in spending there and going there and in the history of my shopping there. So, you've got customers, clients, partners, and trust is an extremely valuable asset. We work really hard to build that trust, and it can be broken easily. So it's rebuilding that trust, because the compliance with this will help maintain a positive image and your credibility. Data minimization. I love this word. To me, this is kind of a new buzzword that's out there. And by new, I think it's probably been the last 1 to 2 years that people have really focused on talking about data minimization in a much broader scale. So, it could have been something that's been out for a while, but it's really been circulated, explained, discussed. I feel like every conference that I'm at, or anytime I go to something with information management and records professional organizations, there is some type of discussion on data minimization. And this is where, specific to privacy regulations, they often require organizations to collect and retain only, that keyword only, the data that is necessary for that specific purpose. Managing excessive data not only helps with compliance, but it also reduces storage costs. It can streamline data management high level. And let's not forget about those DSARs that we all now have come to love. But privacy regulations often really focus on granting individuals specific rights. They have the right to their data. They have the right to know where their information is stored. They have the right to gain access to that. And in some cases, they even have the right to correct it if they find that there's an error with it, and the request for deletion or to be forgotten. All things that we need to keep in mind, and staying in compliance here really ensures that organizations can respond to those requests promptly, because we know that's part of the regulation, and accurately. Leading us to data accuracy and quality. Large volumes of data coming into us all the time, they can become unwieldy. We talk about the wild, wild west. I hear that all the time. Oh, this is the wild, wild west. Oh, we're going to get back into the wild, wild west. You're not wrong. That's going to happen unless you can put things in place to maintain that data accuracy and quality. And so making it very challenging to ensure data accuracy and quality is there. So compliance often requires organizations to maintain accurate records, which can lead ultimately to better decision making and even operational efficiencies. I've noticed several of you guys here are part of global operations. You're international. And many privacy regulations have what we refer to sometimes as an extraterritorial reach, meaning that your organization collects data from individuals in different regions, and you have to comply with those regulations as well. It can be very complex, but it's really essential for businesses with a global presence to be very in tune to that. And then the last one I want to go over here is more of a positive: competitive advantage, innovation, and adapting. So demonstrating a commitment to privacy and compliance, although we've just talked about, the upside of it, the uphill battle of it, ultimately, it really can be a competitive advantage. Customers and partners are increasingly looking for that organization that takes that data protection seriously. And being compliant forces organizations to adapt, meaning they might have to be a little bit more innovative, and even looking at how they might have to adapt the data management practices today because they've evolved. Ultimately, this can lead to efficient and effective data processes and systems. So all good things there at the very end. There's a lot of work that needs to happen up front to reap the benefits of these very positive things here that we've just talked about. Switching over a little bit to records lifecycle management, and the key here is to develop a records lifecycle management strategy that encompasses the entire lifecycle from beginning to end, focusing on the creation of that record, capture, storage, retention, retrieval, and then ultimately what we all want to get to is that defensible deletion, finally getting rid of what we don't need to. Pausing just for a minute to soak this one in. Electronic records management is hard, man. I mean, really, it is hard. I know I can say that. I probably say that once a month, that it is hard. Even physical records management is hard. Now you're introducing electronic records management, and the amount of electronic records or even non-records, you still have to manage those. The volume that comes in daily, I can't even put a number on it anymore. It is just so overwhelming. And so when you have to look and sift through that, it's okay to say that electronic records management is hard, man. It is. And so how can we make it less hard? Well, first off, and many of you here already know this, but I think it will add a lot of value to some of the additional things I want to say, but understanding what is information governance and realizing that it's ongoing, it's an interdisciplinary practice, and ultimately it's managing that data through the life cycle. So as I mentioned, from the beginning all the way to the end, and it's according to the organization's specific business requirements, taking into account also what that risk tolerance might be. There could be risks that are very minimal, they've been identified, and so you could be okay accepting that risk. Other risks are going to weigh really high. They might be high impact, high probability, and in that case, your tolerance might be a little bit different for it. So ultimately, what I want you guys to really feel good about here is understanding that IG builds on the principles of traditional records management and enterprise content. And it's really there to support and help manage it. And again, we're focusing on how the data is created, how it's stored, how it's organized, ultimately deleted. It really is there to encompass a comprehensive strategy to help the organizations get the most value out of their digital information assets while minimizing the potential risks that you're going to have. And you will have risks. So it's all about tracking them, monitoring them, measuring them, ultimately seeing them through to completion. In that sense, IG is really designed to guide and support records management and enterprise content management, while also providing a framework for making smarter decisions, because you're going to be equipped with those resources to make those smarter decisions with regard to what information is valuable to you, where is it best stored, and within which IT information architecture. What you're going to end up finding is that virtually every business process creates and relies on information to function effectively. And so a company's IG strategy can affect the entire organization. When it's properly implemented, that IG strategy will allow for gaining insight to the content that actually has business value. And honestly, depending on what your landscape looks like, it's probably going to surprise you. Most of the time, I find it within the 20 to 30% is that really important information. If you're familiar with an information value pyramid, which I don't have a graphic of today, but you'll see that upper tiny tier, that's your really important stuff. There's a big chunk down there that just really goes to more of your day-to-day, your transactional, your transitory information, even your non-records you can find over there. So what it does is it tries to separate what's really, really important to helping you understand what is either what we refer to as rot, redundant, obsolete, or even trivial. And then that information ends up clogging your servers, causing inefficiencies in your users trying to locate the information that they need to do their jobs. Just wanted to pause. Is there anything in the chat, anything that we need to talk about?
Heather, there's 2 questions in the chat that I don't know if they're a quick yes, no type of answer, but if we need to follow up, we can. I'll go ahead and read them to you. It's 2 questions. Would you agree that records managers of the past are now evolved into information governors? It's a good question.
Yeah,
and
it
the
is.
Second is, there's a plethora of systems and vendors out there. That being said, what have you seen with these companies doing? What have you seen these companies that are doing to help give their clients the ability to apply retention requirements to these systems, similar to what Microsoft does with retention policies and labels across the 365 environment?
Yeah. The second one we should table, because that is going to be much more than a quick answer. The first one, I think, is a very interesting question. I can tell you I have gone from the records manager role to an information governance role. So my answer to that would be yes. However, it depends. However your culture is, however your organization is, they still might want a tiered type organization to be in place. So you might have information governance that falls under your legal, IT operations, whatever, but then you might also have records and information management, which falls somewhere else. So I feel confident in saying it depends on it, but I do see a trend in it, and I can tell you I am one of those. And I know other people very similar to me where we had records management titles before, and that is what we were doing. It was much more paper. It was much more policy. Now it is all the information and having oversight to that. So very, very good questions. Can we follow up with the second person, either at that second question, either if we have time at the end, or let's get them on a list to reach out to follow up on that question, please, Greg.
Most definitely.
All right. You guys have had a few minutes then here to take a look at the information lifecycle and understanding it. So I've touched on a few things already, which is the create, the retain, the dispose, but I do want to highlight a few other things on here. Protect. Protection is super important. Data created or received needs to have proper controls applied to ensure that appropriate access throughout the entire data life cycle is there. We want to protect what's important. We want to make sure if it's a highly sensitive record, it is treated as such. We want to protect that record to make sure it doesn't get out of our systems in any way that it shouldn't. The other one I want to touch on really quick is use and transfer. Data is used by your organization to further its missions and goals. It's used all the time. Your data is put into different spreadsheets. It can be massaged. It can be filtered. It can be used for so much. So the use cases of it will really depend. Transfer, this is actually a really good call out here because some data is created or received by an organization, but then it's transferred out to another entity. So that can be part of a merger and acquisition. It can be part of a divestiture, whatever the case may be. There might be opportunity where information is transferred. And so we need to consider how that information should be treated as well so it's transferred appropriately. Because I just love defensible disposition, I'm just going to touch on this one again here, but really highlighted in the box here, data really needs to be disposed of. You've got your retention schedule for a reason. If there isn't any regulatory, legal hold, business case to keep something longer than it's intended to be kept for the retention schedule, it's expired, it should be defensively deleted. Again, keeping in mind that there's those asterisks. If it's under legal hold, you have to preserve it. If it is, if there's a business reason to hold onto it for something above and beyond, you would want to consider holding onto it a little bit longer. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some information challenges because these will actually go to play very nicely into some of the considerations that you have to take because information governance challenges will bleed into that. Information governance, simply put, really is a holistic approach to managing your information. The number one thing that we see here, and I guess I want to take a step back and add something in here. So for 18 years, I was in-house as a practitioner, worked in the legal department, I worked in operations, I worked in IT. Everywhere I sat with my role as a records manager. Then I came over now and have done 2 years in consulting. So why I think this is important to address is because many of you guys are sitting there as practitioners today, and I've been there not too long ago. And now I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen by working here at Lighthouse and what we've seen as some trends. I'm going to give a couple examples here specific to the silo departments. But typically what we see are 3 broad groups who really have an interest in your organizational data. The first is your business, and I'm loosely defining this as your overall business. And the second group here are your folks in legal, risk, your regulatory departments, your records and information folks even. They have a very high interest in this. And then lastly, we've got a number of IT-related departments who are responsible for implementing the mechanics on information management accordingly. So those are really the top areas that we see. And historically, the different stakeholders have operated in silos. And so while we're going through consulting engagements, we repeatedly see as one of the largest obstacles to success are those silos. Each department might be going in and pursuing their own areas need with governance, not realizing that there are so many others out there and that it could actually be in conflict with some of them as well. And here's a few examples. In many cases, we have a legal department who carries significant weight. Generally, they will argue that they want or are in support of keeping everything forever. On the other side, we have our IT teams. They often bear the burden of the cost, the burden of the management of the organization's data, sometimes running these big projects and programs, which often includes resources to assist in these preservation efforts. And our IT clients are generally shouting from the rooftop about the need to minimize the data. And this is from a cost and resource perspective. And then we have our relatively newcomers. Again, I'm using this term a little loosely, but these are our information security friends, our privacy friends that have come and joined us now in these efforts. And they're really looking at it from that data minimization standpoint. And they're looking at it from a risk perspective. They need the data to be deleted the minute it's no longer needed. They want to protect the organization from any type of data breach or any type of associated reputational damage, whether that be IP loss. And they have to constantly stay on top of the ever-changing regulatory and privacy regulations. Then we've got our information records management people, information governance folks who are here now. We really want everything classified. We want things to have labels. We want things to be able to, when you look at it, you can know what it is, when it should be deleted, what type of metadata can maybe come along to it, who was the creator of it if you had to go back and ask, and we want it in the place in which it belongs, right? We've put a lot of things together to say, hey, when you have this information, store it here, do this with it. And then we've got our end users. They just want to do their jobs, right? They just want to be able to access their information efficiently, to find what they need to do their job. So that's an example of some of the competing priorities that we've got going on in some of the silos. So all this to say that the silos have to come down in order for good information to rise up. Organizations need a cross-function environment and information governance program and a team that has that executive sponsorship to make differences, come into alignment to help make decisions about conflicting information governance needs before the rest of the challenges can really be addressed. The biggest takeaway I want for you guys here on this slide is that the need for communication and collaboration across all interested data parties for all information related conversations needs to happen. So keep that in the back of your mind too, is just continuing the communication, the collaboration, and if you have to, get yourself a seat at that table. Sometimes I've had to do that. Sometimes I've had to raise my hand and say, hey, can I come in? I'm from information governance, or I'm from records and information management. It'd be really helpful to have a seat at that table. Let me touch briefly on the data map. Sorry, folks. Briefly on the data map development here. Data map is a really great thing to have. If you have it, you are so ahead of the game. If not, you're not alone, but creating and maintaining a data map is the critical first step to a strong information governance program. Without knowing what data exists, where it resides, or who has access to it, an organization will not be able to properly meet your legal, regulatory, and business requirements for managing that data. A very thorough data mapping exercise is a massive undertaking. It will not happen overnight. It will require, again, collaboration, teamwork, those silos coming down. You'll have to interview departments, identify document owners, document repositories, where they're at. Once it's complete, it's never marked as final. That's a very key component about a data map. It is ongoing. It should be monitored regularly. You're going to have systems onboarding and offboarding all the time. So doing a constant check-in, maybe it's every 3 months, 6 months, whatever cadence works for you guys. But just know that it doesn't stop the one time you do it. It constantly needs to be monitored, updated, and reviewed. And ultimately, this could become the most valuable tool in quickly identifying and preserving your information. Okay. So let's ask the question, why is too much data a bad thing? Anyone? I'll start chiming in on this too, but if any of you guys have strong feelings about why and you feel comfortable, throw it in the chat. I would also love to hear why you think having too much data is a bad thing. And maybe it's just even building on one of the things that are on here. But over retaining information really can have adverse effects on an organization, including noncompliance with legal and regulatory requirements, increased risk of security breaches, data loss. We've already talked a little bit about cost with high storage, retrieval costs, and even resources. And then productivity. I mean, that's a really big one. You don't realize that until it gets downstream. But reduced productivity due to information overload and inefficient workflows is a real thing. Guilty. I am guilty of having gone into folders or gone into somewhere I'm trying to find something. It took me way too long to find it. And by the time I actually got to it, I realized I didn't even need it. It was outdated. So that was kind of a disappointment. But it made me realize just how much information and data that is still out there that doesn't have value anymore. So therefore, it really is critical for organizations to implement proper data retention and disposal policies, mitigating these risks to improve overall operational efficiencies. A few things here on non-compliance, holding on to information beyond its required retention period. You've got your retention schedule for a reason. So this is what we're saying. If you're not following your retention schedule, it can open you up to non-compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. Thinking also about what we talked about with privacy, you've got GDPR, CCPA, even HIPAA. They're very specific data retention mandates and disposable policies. Again, only holding that information that's needed. Failure to do so could ultimately have damage to your company's reputation. With risk, you're holding on to outdated, unnecessary information. We've talked about how it can cause breaches, IP loss. Even your cyber criminals can really use you as a target. You become a likelier target when excessive data stores become an easy access point for large attacks to happen. And then cost, maintaining large volumes of cost data, whether that's in your physical or digital format, it really does incur significant storage expenses. Productivity, I mentioned that a little bit, but ultimately we want to reduce the time sifting through unnecessary documents, versions, what have you, that irrelevant information. It becomes time consuming. It becomes even a little daunting. People get frustrated. And rather than try to organize the data, I don't know if this is what you're seeing, but championing efforts to go in and organize and clean up that data, it's just like, I just can't, right? Because it becomes so overwhelming. So that being said, over-retained data also can lead to disruptive workflows in collaboration. Employees can spend unnecessary time discussing or even trying to validate that. And it just really isn't needed. So how does classification occur? A well-defined taxonomy will make it easier for you to locate, retrieve, and even manage your records efficiently. But through this, you want to consider metadata, your naming conventions, folder structures, and ultimately establishing a clear system for classifying and categorizing your electronic records. I'm going to focus on four things today: manual, semi-automatic, automation based on objective criteria, and then automation based on IA. So with manual and semi-automatic classification, I'm going to click through these first so that you guys can take a look at this while I go over them. It's exactly what it says it is. It's relying on the end user to manually apply those labels. Information classification through manual application involves categorization based on the sensitivity, the value, other relevant criteria, that metadata that we've talked about. But what it does is it ultimately uses human judgment on those processes. It helps organizations manage and protect their data more effectively because you're requiring your data owners, the people who are most familiar with that information, to classify it. But it does still require educating your staff, having a well-defined policy, and consistent enforcement with it. Some of the things to keep in mind here with manual and even semi-automated classification is periodic review. Regularly review and update your classification as needed, and then also monitor and audit it because it is a manual process. You want to make sure that the information classification is right, everything looks good, and you're just going to be doing a quick audit on that. All right, same thing. Let me click through these so you guys can take a look at it. Similar to manual, but information classification through inheritance actually simplifies the classification process, reducing the risk of that human error in assigning it. And it can be particularly useful when you have large volumes of data. But again, key things to remember here is that you have to define your classification levels in your policy. You have to understand what these inheritance rules are. Basically, it means that any new data created within what we might refer to as a parent will end up inheriting that same classification. So there's definitely an education component to this by understanding what those inheritance rules are and what that classification is. Definitely do that user training. Same thing here, ongoing. You'll want to regularly review the updates and monitor and audit as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about objective criteria. We're getting into, the fun automation part, but automated classification of information using objective criteria is typically achieved through the use of some sort of information management system. It can be a content analysis tool, even machine learning algorithms are some of the things that you'll do here. I wanted to make a top pro and a top con here. So the top pro is efficiency. Automated information classification significantly enhances your efficiencies. At the end of the day, it really does. You're cutting out that manual component. It's moving along a lot quicker. However, accuracy is your top con here. The accuracy of the automated classification can vary depending on the quality of that trained data. So it's important that as you're leading up to all this, you're looking at that accuracy and you're also getting the most that you can out of your efficiency. So automation, full automation based on AI, and Microsoft has a tool to do this, and some really cool things happening here. And AI is a thing. AI is here. It is not going anywhere. In fact, if I can for just a second, in just a short matter of time, I have now become AI myself. So although she doesn't always necessarily look like me, it's the best that I can do. But my point is AI is here. It's not going anywhere. It is only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So we've got these large volumes of data. It can classify them efficiently, especially when human effort alone is insufficient due to the volume, the complexity of the data. And AI-driven classification can overall improve your data organization, the retrieval, information governance within your organizations. All right, taking a look at the time here, knowing we've only got a few minutes. It's like I said, it's everywhere. Just pulled this article on how the National Archives is using AI to make records more accessible in the digital age. This just came out a couple weeks, maybe 1 week ago, October 27th. A really good read on this. They're doing really cool things such as using an AI bot to extract data from DT-214 forms, looking at ways to help with Freedom of Information Acts, just looking at ways that they can do things different with some of the historical information that we have today. All right, change management, because this is really important. Change management is going to require, let me actually step back a second. Electronic records management framework implementation is just not about the technology. It's really about the people. The technology is important, but the people part of it is equally as important. Change management is essential for addressing the human and organizational aspects of the transition, ensuring that the new system is embraced and utilized effectively. So you're going to want to plan for user behavior changes, technological changes, business process changes, and let's not forget about the regulatory requirements as well. A key things here is back to that executive sponsorship. We have to make sure that we are securing the resources, attention, and strategic alignment necessary for successful implementation and maintenance of that enterprise records management solution. There needs to be a clear path. And that executive sponsor is helping with resource allocation. They're helping with priority and focus. They're helping with alignment with your business goals. They're going to be your advocate and help influence. They will ultimately be who you go up to for accountability, risk mitigation, and even sustainability, to name a few things. On this slide here is a brief list of people that you would want to consider as part of your executive sponsorship group. So a change such as what we're talking about is really a seismic change, and that refers to a profound, radical, often disruptive transformation or shift in a particular contents. And in this sense, the change doesn't have to be bad. It just has to be controlled and monitored. And so some of the things that you're going to want to pay attention to here is that these changes can be rapid and unexpected. They can also be hugely transformative for you. Some of them might be disruptive, so you're going to want to make sure that you've got things in place for that, and that there could also be long-lasting impacts. Some changes that we've seen here have been the introduction of disruptive technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, even renewable energy, to name a few. So keep an eye on that change management. Again, it's vital because it's there to address the human and organizational aspects, both equally as important. Executive sponsorship is there to facilitate change management by providing clear direction and setting expectations for employees. So what can you do? I know we've just got another minute or two here, so I'll go through these quickly. Here's some best practices. Create a cross-functional IG team. Conduct comprehensive audits. Continually assess and define your legal and regulatory requirements. Prioritize those IG activities. Train your employees. Development enforcement criteria and follow through. Don't forget about all this hard work that you've done. Continue it by measuring your results. Through this, what you can do is know where your data is, know how to retain, preserve, delete your data as you need to, consult your experts. We're your experts. Reach out for help if you need it, and ultimately determine what your best practices and workflow are. And then this is my last ask. You guys will get this deck as we're wrapping up here. My ask to you guys, is the juice worth your squeeze? Putting together a quick little checklist here, you can go through asking yourself, is my effort, my work, things that I'm going to be putting here, is it worth it? And can I check these things off the box? With that, we've got our next steps here. I'll turn it over to Eric to wrap us up.
Thank you, Heather. Hi, everybody. Again, thank you so much for joining. Just a quick call to action slide here. If you would like to continue this conversation, we'd be more than happy to sit down, have a scoping call, grab Heather or somebody else from our technical team to walk through a call. And you can just reach out on these two emails that are posted there. Again, thank you so much for joining.